вже уявлює, де там писали. Там troviamo la picciotto io, mi tocco qua dentro, sopra dei brano che c'è tutto il suo piccare, che c'è dei a lei non tutto il mio dentro dei esercizi.
Нині не існує.
Не знаю, коли не
Може, проїсали саме до сечення. Є картина. Пише.
А той Англій, що то організував, десь що то організує, то що поставив мені.
Mali świeży materiał, prawda?
Де свої матеріали?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Lawson, Arts, Museums and Libraries Officer of the Bradford Council. It's my particular pleasure to welcome you to this evening and to the Central Library. Bradford is a culturally diverse city, and I think myself and colleagues and our elected members are particularly pleased to be in partnership with the Ukrainian community to celebrate a rich cultural heritage. We have organised a week of events which I hope will reflect something of the richness of the art and culture and the history of the Ukrainian community. And as I say, it is particularly pleasing that we in the library can work together with the community. Won't go on at too much length, but I would very much like to thank both personally myself and also on behalf of colleagues and our elected members, a number of people from the Ukrainian community who have helped. Many others have, and it's always a little invidious to single out names, but I think it's probably defensible as these four people particularly helped. I thank Wally Demchuk, who has worked on exhibitions with the Arts, Museums and Libraries Division before, Mrs. Diacu, both of whom are from the Association of Ukrainians, and I'd also like to thank Mr. Popadinik and Mrs. Smarika from the Federation of Ukrainians. Won't detain you a great deal longer, but I think it will be useful just to indicate the programme. We start off with a lecture by Mr. Semenchenko from Leeds University on the political and historical antecedents of Ukraine. That will finish somewhere around about 8:20, and then there will be coffee and tea available. Tim Smith from the Heritage Recording Unit, which is in some ways part of the division, will be talking about images of Ukraine, and then Mrs. Smerika will be reading a poem. We hope that we will finish about 9:30, give or take a few minutes. I think there is not much more to say beyond to thank you all for coming to this event, which pleases myself and my colleagues greatly. I think to say no more than to introduce Mr. Semenchenko from Leeds University.
Before I started, I'd like to say that in my short talk, the most of geographical and just names will be given in Ukrainian transcription, although all these terms are widely known through Russian in the West. So all my transcriptions will be given, all my transcriptions will be Ukrainian. Also, I'd like to say that in my short talk, I'll aim to prove that the emergence of an independent Ukraine in August 1991 wasn't anything unexpected, as it seems to many Westerners as well. On the contrary, Ukraine's independence was natural and inevitable. In fact, the whole history of Ukraine was a long attempt by millions of Ukrainians to regain the glory of its medieval antecedent, Kievan Rus, which once was the largest and the most powerful state in Europe. On the way to independence, there were a number of various forms of autonomy, ranging from different forms of cultural autonomy to the short periods of complete independence. And these forms of independence prevented the loss of a separate national consciousness and language. In the territory of what today is known as Ukraine, the original homeland of the Slavs was situated. So the Slavs initially lived along the Dnieper, then along the Pripyat River and to the north slopes of the Carpathians, and further up to the Vistula. So the most of the Slavs lived in Ukraine, and in the mid 7th century they started spreading out in all directions. In Ukraine, the center of the Slavs was situated around Kiev, which is here. These Slavonic tribes in Ukraine consisted of about 14 large confederations, with the Polanians playing the leading role. From these tribes, the first East Slavonic state was gradually formed. According to the oldest East Slavonic chronicle, the chronicle of bygone years, written by the monk Nestor of Kievan Cave Monastery in the 11th century, Kiev had been founded at the 5th century, in the 5th century, by a leader of the Polanians called Ki, and Kiev had been named after him. So Ki was his name, and Kyiv, it's Ukrainian name for Kiev. Then in 882, Prince Oleg of Novgorod established himself in Kiev and imposed tribute on the Polanians, and gradually extended his authority over other surrounding tribes. He declared Kiev to be the mother of all the Rus cities or towns. Under Oleg, the political entity Kievan Rus was formed, and its center was in Kiev again. Other important Rus leaders were Prince Sviatoslav, who conquered the tribes to the northeast of Kievan Rus, which is the homeland of the present-day Russians. It's to the northeast from Ukraine. And the next important ruler was Prince Volodymyr the Great, who Christianized Kiev's population in 988. He destroyed the pagan idols and built Christian churches in their place. As a Christian, Volodymyr's contacts with the other European monarchs became much closer. He also was the ruler who annexed what is Western Ukraine today, thereby setting the stage for a long struggle with the Poles for the area. In 1036, his son Yaroslav became the ruler of Rus. His reign was the high point of Kievan Rus history. Yaroslav is often dubbed by historians as the father-in-law of Europe. It caused by the fact that all his daughters and sons were married with members of foreign dynasties. His wife also was a Swedish princess. As we see, his prestige was great indeed. Yaroslav also strengthened the status of the church in Kievan Rus. During his reign, over 400 churches were built, and in 1051, Yaroslav appointed the first native metropolitan of Kievan Rus. His name was Ilarion. Yaroslav's death led to political fragmentation of the country and to the destructive princely animosity which caused the breakup of Kievan Rus. In the 12th century, 10 to 15 hereditary principalities emerged in former Kievan Rus. The most noteworthy principalities being Galicia and Volhynia, which is here, then Chernihiv, and Vladimir Suzdal, which is present-day Russia with center in Moscow. And all these principalities were in competition with each other, and all of them also competed for the city of Kiev. The fact that between 1146 and 1246 about 24 princes ruled in Kiev can tell you much about it. So it wasn't stable at all. And in 1169, one of the princes, called Andrei Bogolyubsky of Vladimir Suzdal, came to Kiev, and he seized it and then set it on fire. And came back afterwards. He came back to Vladimir, and since then on, this principality led its independent political and economic and cultural life. Being quite a remote principality, it was also separated geographically by large forests and marshes. It took me so long to come to it only because I want to show you the absurdity of Russia's claim to Kievan heritage. As you already know, these lands were conquered by Prince Sviatoslav in 964, and 200 years later these lands became self-governed territory again. So since the emergence of Moscow as well in 1147, these lands were known in Europe as Muscovy. However, in the 16th century, in order to strengthen the prestige of the Romanovs dynasty, which was the new dynasty in Russia, in Muscovy then, Romanov dynasty, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich Romanov adopted the name of Rus, and ever since Russians have claimed the history and heritage of Kievan Rus. It is exactly the same as, for example, as if Romanians claim the history and heritage of Rome, just on the ground that once it was part of the Roman Empire and bears the similar name. Under the circumstances of political and political fragmentation and instability in the 13th century, Kievan Rus faced a Mongol threat. By this time, the Mongols had already occupied China, Iran, and Central Asia. And in 1240, the Mongols led by Batu, the grandson of Genghis Khan, destroyed Kiev and exterminated its population. I believe that the next stage towards the next step towards Ukraine's independence was the existence of the principalities of Galicia and Volhynia. Stefan Tomaszewski, a Ukrainian historian, called Galicia-Volhynia the first undeniably Ukrainian state, because at the height of its power in the 13th century, the principality encompassed about 90% of present-day Ukraine. In 1199, Prince Roman of Volhynia united it with Galicia, creating a new imposing conglomerate on the political map of Eastern Europe. In 1203, he gained control of Kiev. Thus, by doing that, all these Ukrainian principalities, except for Chernihiv, not principalities, so all principalities, Ukrainian principalities, came under the rule of one prince. His contemporaries of Prince Roman called him the autocrat of all Rus. So you see that this name was used really in present-day Ukraine, not in Moscow. Rus was used in Ukraine. The next ruler, Danilo of Galicia, in order to counterweigh Mongol influences, in order to counterweigh these influences, he placed his lands under the church rule of Rome. Sorry. In 1253, Danilo became the first Ukrainian king. His wise policy of negotiations with the Mongols prevented his principalities from destruction. Although he had to accept Mongol overlordship, it meant to pay tribute. In fact, his country led an independent political existence. His grandson, Yuri, titled himself the King of Rus. In 1303, because of the weak position of Kiev, where the Mongols' influence was much stronger, Yuri obtained Constantinople's permission to establish a metropolitanate in Halych. The last ruler of Galicia-Volhynia was Yuri, again, he bore the same name. He was a Pole who adopted Orthodoxy. In 1340, he was poisoned by a Ukrainian nobleman under the pretext that he sought to introduce Roman Catholicism. So by the hand of its own elite, Galicia was deprived of its last ruler. Summarizing the above-mentioned facts on the principalities of Galicia and Volhynia, we should say that for at least 100 years after the fall of Kiev, they served as a political base for all Ukrainians. After the decline of Galicia-Volhynia, Ukraine was mainly ruled from outside by her powerful neighbors, and because of its attractive geographical and economic situation. Then Ukraine became an area of interest of their three neighbors, which had great futures ahead. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with its Catholic faith, the Russian Empire to the northeast with its Russian Orthodoxy, and Ottoman Turkey, which is down there. Ottoman Turkey with its Islam, and also the Ottoman Turkey backed the remainders of the Mongols living in the Crimean Peninsula. It's here. It was the situation after Kiev lost, Kiev and Rus and Galicia-Volhynia lost their last leader. So now in approximately 1340 we'll find Ukraine leaderless, and also it's worth mentioning that Ukraine was still, part of it was still under the Mongols. The Lithuanians were the first to take advantage of such a situation. By 1369, the Lithuanians occupied much of what is Belarus and Ukraine today. Belarus is here. Belarus and Ukraine today. There was even a legend in Lithuania that because they really occupied everything here, and including Kiev as well. So there was a legend in Lithuania that their prince Revolved watered his horse from the Black Sea from here. But actually, I doubt it because the water in this sea is quite saline, so it isn't really possible. But anyway, Lithuanian policy toward the Slavs, or Ruthenians, as they were then called, was quite friendly. Ukrainian culture and religion flourished under them. Being pagans themselves, many Lithuanians voluntarily adopted Orthodoxy. The Lithuanians often encouraged Ukrainians by granting them the highest posts in their government. The elite very soon fell under the cultural influence of their Slavonic subjects. Ruthenian, that is Ukrainian and Belarusian, the language of the majority of the population, slowly became an official language of the land. As we see, the part of Ukraine which found itself under the Duchy of Lithuania enjoyed not only cultural autonomy, but I would say that it was rather cultural domination over the Lithuanians. Unlike the rest of Ukraine, Galicia and a large part of Volhynia were occupied by the Poles by 1366. Despite a 20-year-long resistance, of the local nobility. First, the Poles were very careful about introducing changes in Galicia. The King Casimir even referred to Galicia again as the Kingdom of Rus, and Ruthenian was used alongside Latin. But in 1375, a Catholic archdiocese was established in Lviv. Many Galician noblemen adopted Catholicism and the Polish language. By the mid-15th century, when Galicia was reorganized into the Rus province of Poland, there were few reminders of the once proud Rus Principality of Galicia. After the unions of Craiova in 1385 and Lublin in 1569, Poland and Lithuania became the single political entity with a common king, parliament, currency and language. Catholicism became the state religion. As a result, the Ukrainian nobility of Lithuania opted for Catholicism and Polonization. In fact, the Ukrainian noble elite disappeared as a stratum. Another product of the Catholic Orthodox confrontation was the Church Union of Berestia, or Brest, 1596, when a part of the Ukrainian population accepted the rule of Rome, receiving permission to preserve their right and language. This fact became very important for West Ukrainians in the future. For the next 4 centuries, the Greek Catholic Church protected Ukrainian separate culture and language from Polish oppressors. I think that the existence of Cossackdom was the next stage or the next step of Ukrainians to their freedom. And now I'll tell about it. By the end of the 16th century, the focus of events in Ukrainian history switched back from this region back to the east, Kiev and down south. It was an area of the age-long confrontation with the nomads, the confrontation between Christianity and Islam. The oppressive conditions in the west of Ukraine provided many records to independent armed groups which preferred the danger of frontier life to serfdom. Many peasants had run away from their Polish landlords down there to eastern Ukraine. As a result, a new class of Cossack frontiersmen emerged. Initially, the Cossacks concentrated on pushing back the Tatars and Turks down there. All these nomads, they come from south, Crimea in particular. But after some impressive victories over the Tatars and Turks, the Cossacks gradually switched to the Poles, the immediate oppressors. To avoid the Polish authorities, they went down behind the Dnieper Rapids, down there, and they started building fortified camps called siege. The Ukrainian population started treating the Cossacks as defenders against their Polish landlords. For the Polish authorities, the existence of many armed independent Cossacks was worrisome. So they started recruiting them officially. And the nobles who initially began to organize the Cossacks were the remaining Orthodox Ukrainians. Baida Vishnevetsky, the royal official of Kaniv, in 1553 gathered groups of Cossacks, and on the remote island of Khortytsa, which is in today's Zaporizhia, it's here, he established a fort which became known as Zaporozhian Siege. So the most prominent Cossack leader after, before Bogdan Khmelnytsky, after Baida Vishnevetsky, was Petro Sahaydachny. He was elected hetman, that is leader of Cossacks. He was elected in 1616. It was he who allied Cossacks with the politically weak Ukrainian clergy. In 1620 he entered a newly organized Kievan Orthodox Brotherhood together with his units. Under his rule, the Cossacks became a new political leader in Ukrainian society that would uphold Ukrainian religion and culture in the future. Sahaydachny restored an Orthodox metropolitanate in Kiev, despite protests from the Poles. In fact, under Sahaydachny, Cossack lands became self-governed territory that led their independent life, backing the Poles only if it was good for Ukraine. That is why kings of Poland complained that the Cossackdom was becoming a state within a state. During a 45-year period after Sahaydachny's death, 5 Cossack rebellions against the Poles occurred in Ukraine. All these rebellions were unsuccessful. Hence, the Cossacks lost their right of self-determination. A severe and cruel regime was established in Ukraine that led a campaign of terror, and this campaign resulted in the purges and murders of thousands of Ukrainians. In 1648, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, a very wise and skilled politician and military commander, was elected hetman by the Cossacks. In that same year, he began a war against the Polish oppressors. After a number of impressive victories, Khmelnytsky liberated most of Ukraine from the Poles. It is high time to say that it was very difficult then in Europe to win independence on your own without support from a mighty country. Bogdan Khmelnytsky was looking for reliable allies during the whole his period in power. Being surrounded by 3 superpowers, by that time Moscow had become a strong power already. Khmelnytsky first allied with the Crimean Tatars, from here, which were backed by the Turks, as you already know. And first, this alliance wasn't successful because during the war with the Poles, the Cossacks were betrayed by the Tatars a few times. So Khmelnytsky started looking for a new ally. In this respect, the Orthodox state of Moscow seemed to be quite a feasible partner. In 1654, the Treaty of Pereyaslav was concluded, according to which Ukraine united with the Muscovite state as an equal autonomous part. Alexei Mikhailovich, the Tsar, swore to guarantee Ukraine's autonomous status. But in fact, further steps undertaken by the Russians showed that the Treaty of Pereyaslav was only a tactical move in order to subjugate Ukraine. The last possible ally from the immediate surrounding proved to be just another oppressor. That was the reason why Khmelnytsky, before his death, bore an idea of alliance with Sweden, and a number of his letters proving this statement were recently found in Swedish archives. 50 years after, this idea of Khmelnytsky's was implemented by Ivan Mazepa. During these 50 years, the surrounding powers partitioned Ukraine in spite of a desperate resistance from the Ukrainians. For instance, in 1668, Hetman Petro Doroshenko, once again and for the last time before 1918, managed to reunify Ukraine and regain its self-governed status for a short time. But it was the last splash of Cossack resistance in the 17th century. By this time, Ukraine was divided along the Dnieper, with the left bank belonging to Russian Empire, left bank down here, and the right bank divided between the Poles and the Turks. The part enjoying an autonomous status was still the one belonging to Russia. This part was called Hetmanate. Between 1687 and 1709, Ivan Mazepa was the hetman there. Ivan Mazepa was actually a man with European education. He graduated from Vienna University, and he was completely trusted by Peter I, who was the Tsar, the Russian emperor. Using his good relationship with the Tsar, Mazepa was trying his best to maintain at least the status quo. But his stance was at odds with Peter's theory of centralized state. Gradually, Peter I started limiting hetmanate's autonomous status. This situation caused Mazepa's secret agreement with the Swedish King Charles XII against Russia in order to win complete independence for Ukraine. Mazepa believed that such a remote ally wouldn't be able to bid for Ukrainian lands in future. As a result, Mazepa and the Swedes were defeated in 1709 by the Russians. It was a big battle near Poltava here. Mazepa and the Swedes were defeated by Peter I, and Peter I in turn ordered Baturin, Mazepa's residence, to be set on fire. All the population of Baturin was slaughtered as well. Mazepa himself managed to escape to Moldova, here, where he died then. His troops, which followed him, formed the first ever Ukrainian political emigration. The hetmanate was deprived of most of its rights, but there was still a certain amount of autonomy there. Tsar's nominations of hetman indicated certain differences of the hetmanate from ordinary provinces of Russia. For instance, Kyrylo Rozumovsky was appointed hetman under the Empress Elizabeth, and Elizabeth in fact was his sister-in-law. As a Ukrainian, Hetman Rozumovsky tried his best in an attempt to preserve some national Ukrainian distinctiveness. He had the support of the local aristocracy, dissatisfied with their provincial status. Although in a very polite form, they nevertheless made petitions to the Empress asking for a return of their rights. Apart from the hetmanate, Zaporozhian Sich still existed within the Russian Empire. It was down there. So it still existed in the Russian Empire. Cossacks were needed as a force in a Russian extension to the south. But in the mid-18th century, the borders of the Russian Empire reached the Black Sea already. So Zaporozhian Sich was already inside the Russian Empire. It was no longer needed for the Russians. So Catherine II, the next empress, decided to, it was quite dangerous actually for her to have the last remaining strongholds of Ukraine within her country. So first he decided to abolish the hetmanate, and then in 1775 she sent in troops to Hortytsa, and they destroyed the siege. The last Cossack commander, called Petro Kalnyshevsky, was exiled to the north of Russia, where he died at the age of 100 years. So I believe that very important was the next period of Ukrainian political life, which happened back to the West again in Galicia, under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Paradoxically indeed, the next chance for the Ukrainian culture and political rebirth was connected with the misfortune of another nation. After the 3 subsequent partitions of Poland between 1775 and 1795, Galicia found itself in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Fortunately for the Ukrainians, emperor reformers ruled in this multi-ethnic country at the time. Maria Theresa and Joseph II were seeking to provide different ethnic groups with equal rights. Serfdom was abolished in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Ukrainian peasants and clergy previously oppressed by the Poles received an equal status. The Ukrainian church received subsidies from the state. In 1784, a university was opened in Lviv. Alongside Latin and German, theology was taught in Ruthenian, which you remember, Ukrainian was called Ruthenian then. Hence, this situation of Ukrainian theology, then also there were 2 Ukrainian seminaries in Lviv and Vienna as well. Hence, a new Ukrainian elite was formed mainly from clergy there in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This stratum was simply the most educated stratum of Ukrainian society at the time. And finally, Ukrainian primary schools were opened in ethnic Ukrainian villages of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well. In Galicia, the Poles, you remember, they lost their nationhood. That's why in 1848 a revolution occurred in the empire. The main forces of this revolution were the Poles and the Hungarians fighting for their freedom, for their nationhood. And after this revolution, the Poles and the Hungarians were defeated, but nevertheless, the first elections, free elections, occurred after this uprising, and from Galicia alone, about 25% Ukrainians were elected to the parliament. 25% of the Ukrainians were elected from Galicia. Also Ukrainians of Transcarpathia, it's down here, which was under in the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So from Transcarpathia and from Bukovina, so Transcarpathia is there, Bukovina is there, they were elected to the parliament as well. And in Lviv, after the elections, the Supreme Ruthenian Council was established with many local branches in the area, in Galicia. Later, this council started publishing its own newspaper, which became the first Ukrainian newspaper ever. And also, it was very important that the first Ukrainian military regiment, called Sichovi Streltsi, was formed in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Taken into account an anti-Ukrainian policy led by Tsarist authorities in eastern Ukraine, Tsarist I mean Russian authorities in eastern Ukraine, these policies consisted in the introduction of serfdom in Ukraine in 1775. Ironically, it was the same year when serfdom was abolished in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you can see the difference. So Also, these policies consisted in persecutions of Ukrainian activists. For instance, Taras Shevchenko, the father figure of the Ukrainian nation and its prophet, was recruited by force in 1847 to the Tsarist army, where he spent many years. And also in persecutions of the very Ukrainian language in the Russian Empire. Ukrainian language was banned from public life in 1876 by the Ems decree of the Tsar. And taking into account all these facts, we will understand the importance of the above-mentioned Ukrainian institutions in Galicia. Galicia was the place where Eastern Ukrainians also managed to publish their books and articles at the time when Ukrainian language was banned in Eastern Ukraine. In 1905, after the first Russian Revolution, the first elections were held in the Russian Empire, in which Ukrainian parties won many seats. The local councils of Odessa and Poltava, ironically, it's southern Ukraine. Odessa is down there, and Poltava is here. So now both areas are quite Russified. But ironically, in 1905, the local councils of these two towns issued petitions demanding recognition of Ukrainian as the official language of Ukraine. But in the course of the next decade of reaction, all Ukrainian institutions were abolished. Following the First World War and the Second Russian Revolution in February 1917, the Central Council was convened in Kiev. Ukraine was proclaimed an autonomous part of Russia, and Mikhailo Hrushevsky was elected the first president of Ukraine. In January 1918, complete independence was declared, followed by the Bolshevik coup d'etat in Moscow and St. Petersburg, which was the capital of Russia then. In January 1918, complete independence was declared. After the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918, an independent West Ukrainian state was proclaimed in Lviv. In 1919, the two Ukrainian states merged into a unified Ukrainian People's Republic. Altogether, between 1917 and 1920, 3 subsequent Ukrainian governments ruled in Ukraine. During this period, Ukraine's independence was recognized by a number of countries. But then Ukraine was invaded by Bolshevik troops sent in by Lenin. The so-called Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was formed, which in 1922 entered the Soviet Union. Of course, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was only a puppet state of Russia, which couldn't protect its population from Russian chauvinism. The terror famine of 1933, organized by communist leaders of the USSR and Ukraine, the purges and murders of Ukrainian intelligentsia, persecutions of dissidents, the Chernobyl catastrophe, or as it is known here, Chernobyl catastrophe, make up a great part of the list of crimes of this Ukrainian state against its own people. Nevertheless, I would have said that there were several positive aspects of this form of autonomy. They were as follows. I think that there were only 3 positive sides of this state. The first was the policy of Ukrainianization of the 1920s, which called the return of Ukrainian to the Russified Eastern Ukrainian cities then in the 20s. The second one was the unification of all Ukrainian lands in 1939. It was carried out by the Soviet army according to the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Although a cruel and painful process, it was historically important for today's Ukraine. And the third point is that it was Ukraine's acceptance to the United Nations in 1946. So Ukraine entered the United Nations as a separate from the Soviet Union state. I would like to touch upon one more episode of Ukrainian history that occurred in Transcarpathia in 1939. So this small part of Ukraine, Transcarpathia, this part of Ukraine was separated for about 800 years from the rest of Ukraine. And it was mainly under the Hungarians all these 8 centuries. Being part of the West Ukrainian state in 1918 and the unified Ukrainian People's Republic in 1919, it was then incorporated into Czechoslovakia, a new state that also emerged from the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in the face of German and Hungarian invasion and internal ethnic problems, the central Czechoslovakian government allowed the creation of Slovak and Ukrainian autonomies in 1939. So in 1939, that same year, general elections were held and a parliament of an autonomous state of Carpathian Ukraine was formed in Khust, which is here. And priest Augustin Voloshin was elected president. Following German occupation of the Chetlands and Hungarian occupation of Slovakia, Carpathian Ukraine proclaimed its independence and sent its regiments, which were known as Carpathian Siege, to defend its territory. Within a month, the Ukrainian troops were defeated, and Carpathian Ukraine was occupied by Hungarians. But the fact of the existence of Carpathian Ukraine was very important in Ukraine's history. For the first time, a Ukrainian ruling body was convened as a result of the free elections. Independence was proclaimed, and the Ukrainian army resisted foreign aggression. According to international law, Carpathian Ukraine could have been recognized as an occupied state. So as we see, the history of Ukraine was a never-ending succession of the various political and cultural autonomies that in 1991 finally resulted in the proclamation of Ukraine's independence and its recognition by over 100 countries. That's all I wanted to tell you.
Coffee will be served in the junior library. Now, maybe some people would like to ask Mr. Sevenchenko some questions, but they could come later, probably. There will be biscuits, and the biscuits are provided courtesy of Colos Baker, one of the sponsors. We'd like to go through to the junior library.
Could everybody see the screen? Because I've erected this large thing here. Is everyone all right? Yeah. Well, what I'm actually going to do this evening is show you some pictures, some of which you may have seen already on show in the foyer, and some which are part of the larger exhibition that I and several other people who I mentioned along the way put together. Because the exhibition that you passed on your way in here this evening is just part of a much larger show, which unfortunately we couldn't fit it all in here because of the limitations on space. But if people are interested in seeing the exhibition in its entirety, it's going to be on in Halifax in, I think it's July. But if you're in, we're obviously going to be sending publicity about the exhibition to the association, federation and the churches and so on. So if what you see out there whets your appetite for some more and you didn't manage to see it in Keighley, come down to Halifax and it will be on there. Now the exhibition was was put on as part of my work, which, as Paul mentioned in the introduction, my work as kind of coordinator of the Bradford Heritage Recording Unit. The unit was set up 10 years ago in '83 as part of arts museums and libraries to do a history of people in the Bradford area, really. I mean, that the Bradford area included outlying districts like Howard, Keighley, Ilkley and so on. And rather than look at history in a kind of traditional sense, what we wanted to do was to go out and talk to people who weren't necessarily represented in the written books that you might find upstairs here. I mean, for example, take the textile industry. You've got life stories of Lister, you've got the life story of people like Titus Salt. But what was missing were the kind of stories of the so-called ordinary people of Bradford, the people who actually worked in the mills themselves. And as the project got underway, what we also realised was missing was the history of the Eastern European communities in the city. I wasn't actually working for the unit when it first got off the ground, but apparently somebody came down to the library to see what they had on the Eastern European communities in Bradford, and all they could find was some press clippings from the Yorkshire Post from the 1950s or something. And we didn't really, the people that worked at the unit felt that because Bradford had such significant Polish, Ukrainian and other Eastern European peoples living here, that was one of the projects that they were going to set up initially as a priority. So what people started to do was to go out and talk to Ukrainians with tape recorders, and I know there's quite a few familiar faces who have probably undergone that ordeal on behalf of the unit. And that was set up as an archive, which is now accessible through the facilities upstairs. So if people are interested in, reading the interviews that we've done, if you go up to the 5th floor, there are transcripts and the tapes and so on there. And also what we began to do as people were talking about the stories of their lives both in Ukraine and making their way here and establishing themselves as a community here, people would bring out photographs and so on. So we started to copy those so that an archive was created of people's family photographs and so on. And then I actually got involved when the unit expanded to actually taking on photographers, and I initially started just as a photographer, and we actually started to go out and take pictures of the Ukrainian community, pictures in the churches, in the clubs and people's homes and so on. So that was the kind of foundations to the exhibition which you're going to see outside, and the foundations to some of the pictures that you're going to see here tonight. And one kind of role that I don't really relish at working at the unit is actually one of giving talks, because I'm expected to turn up and talk to a room full of people who've worked in textiles all their life and talk to them about textiles, or I'm expected to come to a room full of Ukrainians and talk about the Ukraine, which to me is totally ridiculous. So I'm not going to really talk about the Ukraine. What I'm going to talk about is a kind of personal view of how we went about organising the trip and what happened while we were there, and talk kind of specifically about the photographs that are in the exhibition, because to do otherwise, I'm sure I would put my foot in it on several occasions and get the facts all upside down and wrong. Now, having said that, if there is anybody that wants to say anything while I'm talking